Oh, hello there. Sorry I'm late. And welcome to another. Is there such a thing as late in the age of the internet? I mean, we're not, ABC where Jimmy Kimmel goes on every single night at 11:35, or are we? Anyway, welcome to Saturday's streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. And today we are going to conquer a large subject, but we're going to try to go through it mercifully quickly. And this is what changed the sound of music. And I'm not referring to Julie Andrews in the Alps. I am referring to the way that music sounds because music sounded differently at different times. This is true within our own lifetime, assuming that we're sort of older than toddler age. And it's certainly true if you go back into history. You could also explain this phenomenon by looking at different world cultures where music sounds differently. When one says classical music, one in this culture would refer to European classical music. But if one was in India, one might be referring to raga. If you were in China, you might be referring to traditional folkish and classical Chinese traditions. And these all sound very different. But for the purposes of this show, which is mostly on American and European music, we're going to stick with that. Maybe we'll do one about another broader continental set of cultures on another episode. And I want to start in the 19th century because that was the first century when music really became an industry. It was the first time that there was a major profit motive associated with music. And far from diluting music, it actually improved music because the contrast was music that was for the private pleasure of the ruling elite. Prior to the 19th century, there was, and we're talking about secular music here. Secular music prior to the 19th century was generally reserved for the elite who could pay for its performance or the commissioning of its composition. Why was the word chamber music made? Because the music was performed in the chambers of great stately manners. Now, this wasn't to say that common people, regular old folks, couldn't listen to music. Of course, they could. The place where they heard sophisticated music was generally in the church. In much of Europe, there are exceptions because in Orthodox Christian churches, you hear vocal music, you hear sacred liturgical chanting, but Orthodox churches do not have instrumental music. However, Catholic and Protestant, at least most Protestant churches, did have music. And in Western and Central and much of Southern Europe, outside of Greece and places in the Southeast, you would have musical exposure in church. But this was sacred music. What about secular music? Well, secular music would have been played in village squares and saloons and taverns and pubs and places like that. But the music was all performed by amateurs and the quality showed. That's not to say it wasn't enjoyable. The sophisticated music, the professional music, was reserved for the elite. This changed in the 19th century. I've gone over this before. Now, what does this mean for the sound of music? Well, the orchestra between 1800 and 1900 grew in size, it grew in musical precision and sophistication. The instruments became better made. The violin bows, the brass instruments, the woodwind instruments. And so by the time you get to the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th, the orchestra sounded very different. The modern, romantic, lush, precise, beautiful orchestra that we tend to associate with European classical music at its zenith, that was something that occurred in the middle of the 19th century and continued under the auspices of people like Richard Wagner, who was probably the biggest influence on the professionalization of the orchestra. I've done an entire video, several in fact, on that, so I'm not going to belabor that for this video. What else happened in the 19th century? Well, new instruments were made. There was the Wagner tuba. There were various marching instruments like the sousaphone, which took the basic concept of the modern orchestral tuba and made it somewhat portable because, again, military music and march music became that much more sophisticated in the 19th century as well because of composers in places like Prussia that had a very increasingly sophisticated military band history. In France, it happened as well. In the British Empire, it happened as well. In the United States, it happened, of course, with John Philip Sousa, whose name, of course, invented an instrument. Earlier than that, in the 1840s, Adolf Sax invented the saxophone. And while it didn't change music immediately or even in his lifetime, it did change the sound of music in the 20th century, where the popularity of the saxophone became huge. The early jazz musicians of the 1920s adopted the saxophone, and ever since then, it is probably the instrument most associated with this 20th century genre, more so than any other instrument. So while Adolf Sax himself did not live to see the embrace of the saxophone by several genres, including military bands, especially jazz, later soul, R&B, rock and roll, and experimental music, he had the lost laugh in that sense. Now, when we're talking about the sound of music, a lot of this is about both musical performance and musical delivery. And what do I mean by that? Well, normally you would get music delivered to you in only two ways. Either you would perform the music yourself, or you would be in the same geographical location as a musician making the music. For much of human history, from the Garden of Eden up to the late 19th century, that was the case. But in the 19th century, this also changed. Now, the most interesting of these two developments at the time were the mechanical instruments that played themselves. See, I told you I'm going to sound like Jimmy Kimmel. These were, of course, player pianos, player organs, and you had many other instruments, like the sort of fair organs, where you would have mechanical instruments that could play wind, brass, percussion, and various kinds of organ pipes. And these instruments proved to be a huge success. The player piano was massively popular at the time, not least because when you switch off the mechanical parts of the instrument, you can play it like a regular piano. Around the same time, recorded sound came into it, the famous Edison cylinder. Now, why was the player piano more popular than the Edison cylinder? Because the cylinder, like any other recorded medium, actually allowed a well known, much laureled musician to record into a device where you could then take the physical media and play it back on the appropriate equipment. Well, the fidelity of the original Edison cylinders were really, really bad. Where the fidelity of the player piano is arguably better than any recorded sound, because it's an actual instrument. It's an actual piano that is equipped with a specific mechanical device that reads a roll, a sheet of paper that looks somewhat like a braille, an inverted braille piece of paper, and it plays the music that was recorded, if you will, by a musician who punches the little holes in the roll based on what he plays at the piano or organ or any other instrument of your choice. So that changed the sound of music. The theater organs of the late 19th and early 20th century changed the sound of music as well. You could argue that the organ throughout its history has done more to change the sound of music than any other instrument, because the organ throughout its existence has got bigger and bigger, and the sound palette of the organ has got wider and wider. And this reached its apotheosis with the theater organ. Some of the larger theater organs, whether Wurlitzer or any of the other famous brands of the era, they could sound like a flute, a trumpet, a trombone, a train. It could sound like a waterfall. It could sound like a marching band. It could sound like a percussionist. It could sound like any type of traditional organ sound and all of the variations thereof. It changed the sound of music. These massive theater organs sounded different than anything that came before them. And that is the gist, the essence of this conversation that we're having, or stream, if you will. It's about what introduced new sounds that were hitherto unknown, except in the imagination, to the public. So while we're in the 1920s, another huge advancement that changed the sound of recordings was invented, and this was electronic recording. Gone were the age of these acoustical cylinders and other contraptions, and now we have the electromechanical shellac disc. This increased the fidelity of recordings immensely, gave birth to the record, the 78 RPM record, changed the sound of music, as did the radio, an invention which predates the 1920s, but really became a massive phenomenon in the first world in the 1920s. It changed the way that music sounds, not only the way that it's delivered to us, but the way that it sounds itself. Um, the 1930s had a lot of interesting innovations as well. You had the first electric pianos, you had the first electric organs, you had in the 40s the first electric guitars. These were sounds that we never heard before. And what was interesting about this is that the goal of the electric piano, the electric guitar, and the electric organ was to take the sounds of well known instruments and amplify them, make them louder, give them the ability to fill larger spaces. In the case of the organ, which could already fill a large space with a lot of sound, it was about portability. Now, you'll be saying, well, the Hammond organ is one of the least portable instruments ever. True, but compared to a pipe organ, whether a theater organ or a concert organ or a church organ, it is portable because if you've got three strong men, you can bring a Hammond organ from one location to another, where pipe organs are more or less a part of the architecture of a structure, and to dismantle them takes weeks. And it usually only happens once or twice in the lifetime of an instrument, if ever. Um, what was interesting, though, about these instruments is that as time went on, they became their own thing. In other words, the Hammond organ, very shortly after its invention, was no longer seen as just a substitute, a portable substitute for the pipe organ. It was seen as a great instrument in and of itself with a unique sound that people loved. And the same is true with things like Fender Rhodes and Wurlitzer electric pianos. Yes, they were more portable than a grand piano or even an upright piano, but people came to appreciate them for their unique sounds, which is why you have musicians like Bill Evans, for instance, who play both Chick Corea, because they have different sonic qualities. Now, the guitar has always been very portable. In fact, it's an instrument that before rock and roll was most associated with both classical Spanish music and with folk music throughout many cultures. But the electric guitar, when it came out, it made the guitar sound different, just as the Hammond organ did for the organ, and Wurlitzer, Fender Rhodes, and other electric pianos did for the piano. And much like the saxophone became the instrument du jour of jazz, the electric guitar did the same for rock and roll. And when you think about it, the electric guitar really came out in the 40s with some prototypes in the 30s, and rock and roll, let's say mid 50s, is when it became a thing. The distance between the invention of the electric guitar and its adoption into a musical genre that featured it more so than any other instrument was a relatively short space in time. Certainly much shorter than that between the invention of the saxophone in the 1840s and the early 20th century origins of jazz, where the saxophone became the main instrument. Now, while we're in the 40s and early 50s, we have to talk about another piece of technology that changed the way music sounds, and this is high fidelity, made possible by the magnetic tape. Now, the magnetic tape was invented in 1930s Germany, but was only heard in Germany. After the war, the tapes made by a company called Magnetophone were stolen by the people who fought the war. Some went to Russia, and you have to do it, folks. And some went to America, and the ones that were brought to America later became the basis of the Ampex Corporation. And Bing Crosby, when he heard the fidelity of these tapes, said, I've got to use it. It was used in broadcasting because it meant that you could have a live signal going out, but the affiliates of the radio station in the West Coast or other time zones could simply use the tape to record the broadcast, and virtually no quality was lost the way that it would if you recorded it onto a shellac disc, which itself was a much more cumbersome recording process. Tape and the high fidelity and later stereo, which it made possible, changed the way music sounds. In terms of consumers, the invention of the long playing record at the end of the 40s became a huge thing that changed the way music sounded. Now, we've talked about the way that it changed the way music was composed in another video, so I won't bore you with that. Long story short, it invented the concept album, the idea that pop artists weren't just recording a series of songs, but a cohesive set of music made up of individual songs. And Frank Sinatra was, of course, the pioneer of that even before the Beach Boys, Beatles, and others. But in terms of the fidelity, in terms of the way music sounded, the LP was a huge improvement on the shellac disc, in the same way that the electronic shellac disc was a huge improvement over the acoustical cylinder. So where are we now? We're in the 1950s. So once tape became the standard method of recording and even became an audiophile listening format for consumers in the 50s, something else the tape made possible came to be. And this was called overdubbing, because with tape, and when you've got more than one track, you can record various things at various times. You can record with yourself, harmonize with yourself. You can record a rhythm guitar track on one track, and then on track two, you can record a lead guitar track, etc. And the musician who pioneered this the most was, of course, Les Paul, a man, of course, who a very famous guitar is named for. And not a lot of people used overdubbing in the 50s apart from Les Paul. You would have some vocalists who would have the backing track recorded separate from the vocal track. Sinatra hated that, for instance. He always recorded his vocal live, but some recorded it that way. But where the essence of overdubbing really became something that was hugely influential on the way music sounded was in the rock music of the 60s and every subsequent decade. Rock musicians wanted a larger sound, a more diverse sound, but since most rock bands had maybe 3, 4, or 5 people in them, there's only so much 5 people can do at one time. But if you space that out, you can use the multi-track tape to have those 5 people doing many things throughout the course of the day, and then it all comes together nicely on the master tape that mixes all of these multi-track stems together. And of course, the number of tracks influenced the way music sounded as well. By the end of the 60s, you got 8 tracks, then 16, then 24 by the mid 70s. So much so that by the end of the 70s, you had Martin Scholes of Boston record an entire album where he's playing every instrument. And voila, the magic of multi track recording. It created music that sounds different than it could have possibly done before the age of tape, and specifically before the age of multi track tape. And so let's jump back in time a little bit into the 1960s, because in the 60s, synthesizers came to be a thing. There were already various keyboard instruments that created music that, roughly speaking, was supposed to synthesize the sound of other instruments. There was, of course, the Chamberlin and more famously the Mellotron, the world's first samplers, if you will. Now, how did these instruments work? Well, they weren't a synthesizer. They were essentially several tape decks that were connected to a organ or piano style keyboard. They were hugely heavy because in the Mark II model of the Mellotron, you had all of these tapes in this huge instrument with 2 keyboards next to it. And on each tape, you had a recording of an instrument playing every note of the octave. You had a violin, you had a violin section, you had a trumpet, you had a brass section, you had choir, male and female choir, you had drums, you had every instrument. And instead of needing those instruments all being there with you, you'd have a mellotron. Kind of like what the theater organs accomplished, but in this case, it was done not by organ stops, it was done, and organ pipes, it was done by tape recording. And it was a revolutionary instrument. The Moody Blues probably used it more than anyone else, but the Mellotron was all over so much music in the 60s, 70s, and even a little bit into the 80s. But at the end of the 60s, something came about which actually synthesized sound waves. It was not about simulating instruments the way the Mellotron did with recordings or the organ before it did in other ways with wind. This was about sculpting sonic structures itself. And the most famous of these instruments was the Moog synthesizer. There were other proto synthesizers, things like the theremin that was invented in the 20s and sort of made famous by the Beach Boys with good vibrations. And woo! That was the theremin, but its sound palette was limited. It was mainly a novelty. The synthesizers that Robert Moog introduced revolutionized sound by allowing artists to sculpt the sounds around them, and they did it in very interesting ways. The lead synthesizer, made probably most famous by the Mini Moog, a portable version of the modular Moog, it changed the way music sounded. And how did it do it? Well, for the simple but profound reason that it introduced hitherto unknown sounds into the repertoire. And throughout the 70s, Moog had many great instruments. There was the Poly Moog, which allowed you to play more than one note at once, because the initial Moogs, it was monophonic, one note at once. The Poly Moog allowed for chords, it allowed for harmony. There was the Moog Taurus bass pedal of 75, not the first ever bass pedal, but by far the most popular. It allowed people to play the bass with their feet. Think Mike Rutherford, who did it, but everyone and their brother used it as well. Lots of other great synths came out throughout the 70s. The company ARP had so many great synthesizers. The ARP Odyssey, for instance, was a hugely influential instrument throughout the 70s, almost at the level of the Moog. Tony Banks, again of Genesis, was very much fond of that. The ARP string ensemble in the mid 70s became hugely popular because this was sort of designed as a substitute for the mellotron. The string sound of the mellotron proved to be probably the most famous sound, but the mellotron was big and bulky, and unless you knew how to engineer the instrument the way that Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues did, it was subject to breakdown. The string ensemble of ARP was supposed to change that, but it sounded completely different than the mellotron. Changed the sound of music. So many other great synths in the 70s. Oberheim was a company that in the late 70s created the Oberheim OBX, and in 1983 the OB8 became a hugely popular instrument. Again, at the end of the 70s, Sequential Circuits came out with its Prophet 5 and its more expansive Prophet 10 in 1980. Hugely influential instruments. We were all turning Japanese in the 70s, and Yamaha came out with its huge GX1 synthesizer that was really supposed to replace every existing keyboard in a huge synthesizer. It looked kind of like an organ if it were made by outer space people. And it had a lead synth, it had multiple chordal layers. It could sound like anything, but it was huge and it was expensive. A less huge, but more popular, probably because it was less huge, instrument came out in 77 by Yamaha, the CS80. On so many albums. Hugely influential. And then one of the first super popular digital synthesizers came out by Yamaha in 83, the DX7. Now, you'll remember the term sampler that I used. Well, by the end of the 70s, we get the first digital computer-based sampler in the form of the Fairlight CMI. Now, this was huge and it was bulky, but it would allow people to record sounds from the real world and sample them on a keyboard, whether they were found sounds like the sound of glass breaking or someone clapping, or the sounds of other instruments. And it would let you shape them on an early touch screen with a wonderful little pen. Very interesting stuff. This set off the craze of sampling based keyboards, like the EMU emulator, and like the instrument of Frank Zappa's choice from the early 80s to the end of his life, the Synclavier. Sometimes called the Synclavier. Call it what you will. Cheaper sampling technology came about as well, and this enabled hip hop to use this as its saxophone, as its electric guitar. So if the saxophone was uniquely definitional in jazz, and if the electric guitar was uniquely definitional in rock and roll, the sampler and another instrument that was from the 70s, Sly Stone and Arthur Brown used it, but it really came of age in the 80s, and this was the drum machine. So between the drum machine and the sampler, hip hop had its main definitional instruments, and they weren't invented all that long before hip hop became a genre. I realize we need to go back in time again because I forgot the electric bass guitar. The electric bass guitar really only became known in the 50s, and the first person to play it was Monk Montgomery, one of Wes's brothers. He pioneered electric bass, but by the 70s, electric bass was much more common on almost every album than was the old contrabasso, the acoustic bass. So whether you were playing a rock album, a jazz fusion album, a country and western, a pop album, the electric bass guitar became more influential and more ubiquitous in popular music than the traditional acoustic bass. So where are we now in the 80s? Something else changed the way that music sounded in the 80s. Digital was here. Had its roots in the 70s, but it was in the 80s where digital recording first became a thing. Companies like 3M and Sony pioneering it in terms of digital recorders, and of course Sony and Philips with their joint invention of the compact disc revolutionized playback systems in the 80s. Now, digital versus analog is an issue that burns very much today in terms of quality. In terms of ease, there's no contest. In terms of recording and editing and playback, and in most cases storage, digital is superior. In terms of playback, there's an interesting argument. The difference between an acoustic Edison cylinder and electrically recorded shellac disc, no contest. The shellac disc superior. The level of quality between a shellac disc and an LP, no contest. The LP superior. The quality of the magnetic tape and every other sound format that pre-existed it, that predated it, no contest. The magnetic tape sounded better. But with digital recording, we get into the first time where maybe one could make the argument that the sound of music wasn't changed. Because by the time digital was invented, magnetic tape recording and even the audiophile LP by companies like Mobile Fidelity, it made the mainstream analog format so damn good that digital had competition from older formats. And many people made the argument at the time that while more convenient, digital sounded less good. Certain genres adopted it faster than others. Classical music studios and classical music record labels adopted it much more rapidly than popular music. Why? Well, classical music is very dynamic. And in the quieter sections, you can sometimes hear some of the sonic manifestations of analog shortcomings. You can hear tape hiss, or you can hear clicks and pops on an LP record. You can hear them more overtly than you can on louder sections of music. And so digital doesn't have those artifacts. Digital is able to achieve complete silent playback, which makes the definition of quiet recordings generally better. But others argue that digital lacked some of the soul and fidelity of analog. And this argument goes on to this very day, which shows you that by the 80s, the gap between the new formats was increasingly narrow. No one in good conscience could argue that a 78 record or an Edison cylinder sounds better than an LP or a magnetic tape. But there are many people that have loads of YouTube videos and even some scientific and pseudoscientific studies comparing the quality of analog and digital. So now we're in the 90s. The sampler, the sequencer, MIDI, the drum machine are all with us. The digital synthesizer has largely replaced the analog, even though Dr. Dre loved his analog synthesizers even in the 90s. The electric guitar is part of rock and roll history. So is the saxophone in terms of jazz history. Multi-track tape is here, whether it's digital or analog. And so what comes next? The computer workstation. Now we're looking at something replacing the studio itself. And initially, the quality of these computer workstations was noticeable because the recordings didn't sound as good as those recorded in a traditional studio with a traditional console and traditional recorders, whether analog or digital. But by the turn of the 2000s, that had largely changed. And we're again in the stage now where people today, much like analog and digital, will argue, well, can you tell the difference between a guy doing it on a MacBook on his digital workstation at home versus a traditional recording studio? For a lot of genres, particularly those that don't require acoustic instruments being mic'd up, a lot of people would argue that you can't hear the difference. Although, when it comes to miking up a piano, let's say, or a string section in an orchestra, the professionals still definitely have the edge. The presence of the digital workstation, I mean, Mark of the Unicorn was one of the first, but then Pro Tools became the standard by the end of the 90s. Something else was invented around this time that changed the way that music sounds. Auto tune. Do you believe? The first song that really made autotune famous. Now, when Cher did her, what was her song? Believe, I think it was called. You can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. Autotune was used as an effect, but shortly thereafter, because Cher obviously can sing, she's got a very good voice. Others who can't really sing used it as a crutch, because now anyone could sound halfway decent, because even if you're flat or sharp, you could go in and have someone fix it with autotune. And you could argue that that still is having a huge impact on the way music sounds. Now, some people cannot detect autotune when it's used as a crutch rather than an effect. Some people can. Again, this is a common theme. As we get further and further on, the ability to detect these changes becomes less obvious. If you heard a barely audible Edison cylinder and compared it to a magnetic tape, anyone could tell the difference. But in many double-blind tests, you cannot tell the difference, for instance, between a very high-quality magnetic tape and a very high-quality, high-resolution digital recording. Same problems now with autotune. Is that guy just singing that way, or is that autotune? A lot of people are fooled. And now we get into the real foolishness of the way that music sounds different. AI. Now, Rick Beato famously played an entire song that was written by AI, and he dissected it using AI technology that tried to reverse engineer it. It isolated the stems, the proverbial multi-tracks from the final mix. And what he found is that with AI recordings, there is a lot more bleed in between the different sounds that are literally synthesized in a singular moment compared to multi-track recordings where musicians are playing their instruments and each is recorded onto a different track. So forensically, Rick Beato was able to prove that a song that most people suspected was AI was in fact AI. Does the general public know? Does the general public care? Are we in an age where popular music has become more peripheral than it was in the golden age of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, that people now don't even care if their music is AI? In the late 80s, they certainly cared that the two dancers and fashion models, Rob and Fab of Milli Vanilli, weren't singing on the records. Humans were singing into a tape and a multi-track tape recorder. Now they don't even care if there's any human input, which shows you how our culture has shifted and we place less of a value, at least some of us do, on the originality of music. And 1989 was not that long ago. The Milli Vanilli scandal was huge. Now people go, when they hear that this song that sounds kind of sort of like Miley Cyrus or kind of sort of like a Three Doors Down clone. I know that's dating it a bit, but you know what I mean. Rock music has sort of had a bit of atrophy, let's say, in the last 20 years. Now, they don't even care if it's AI. What next will change the way that music sounds? Are the most dramatic changes over? The amateur orchestras of the early 19th century to the professional Wagnerian orchestras, the shift from the Edison cylinder to the shellac disc to the tape to the LP to the compact disc and digital recording. Where are we going next? And now that all of it can be simulated, what goes around comes around, and the next big change might be rehumanizing music, the same way that all food used to be organic, then they had pesticides and GMO and Monsanto and all the rest of it. Now, hey, look, this is organic food. This was just, someone dug a ditch, put some horse crap on it, watered it a bit, and now there's your organic food. Well, it used to just be called food, a bit like, well, tonight I'm going to have Chinese food, or as they might say in Beijing, food. Are we going to do the same thing with AI? This is the latest hits now featuring humans. You just never know. Anything is possible. But let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.